Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Therapist Theater. My name is Josh Treese, and I'm a marriage and family therapist. I'm coming to you from Music City, USA, where I operate a private practice and host this podcast that takes a look at relationships and mental health through the lens of movies, TV, and pop culture. Every week, I interview a different guest therapist, and we discuss a movie of their choosing and what relationship or mental health issues it presents. Every week, I finish the interview and text or call Leigh-Ann when I'm done. And every week I say, this is the best one yet, or this is my favorite one. But ever so often, I can see that an episode isn't just good, but it's important. And this is one of those. It's not important because of me or anything that I've done or did. It's important because both the movie and the guest bring beautiful perspectives to us that can help us, if we're willing, to see what life is like for someone who is not in the privileged majority and what it could be like if those of us who are could be a little more curious and open. This week's guest is Gert Comfrey. I loved the time that I got to spend with Gert. They've not only got a master's in marriage and family counseling and therapy from Trevecca like I do, but also a master's of theological studies from Vanderbilt. So when they chose this week's movie, The Miseducation of Cameron Post, I knew the conversation would be incredible. Here's a brief summary for the movie from Amazon. A teenage girl is forced into a gay conversion therapy center by her conservative guardians. While there, in the face of intolerance and denial, she meets a few fellow sinners, including an amputee stoner and a Lakota two-spirit. Together, these teens form an unlikely family as they fight to survive. I know you're going to love this conversation as much as I did. Make sure you let me know what you thought on Twitter at Therapist Theater, theater spelled THTR, or on Instagram, Therapist Theater, spelled all the way. And while you're there, click that follow button so you don't miss out. Oh, and if you haven't subscribed to the show yet, hit that button so you don't miss an episode of Therapist Theater. All right, let's dim the lights, raise the curtain, and start the previews. Welcome to the theater. Gert, welcome to the theater.
Thank you.
I am so beyond excited to get a chance to meet you, to have you in. I am a giant fan of Dr. Hopkins, and she is a giant fan of you, and so by the transitive property, I am a giant fan of you, and so it's just great to have you. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I'm excited to talk about this movie today.
Yeah.
And excited to share some space.
Well, before we get to the movie, I like to start every conversation, every interview with just asking my guest, why therapy?
Yeah, that I've sat with that question a lot. I'm a big believer in the idea of vocation. So this idea of being called to work in the world. And I think for me, therapy and being a therapist is a part of that bigger vocation that I have of being with people, being a witness to people's lives, sharing space, wrestling with big, deep, profound questions. So I think it's kind of a natural fit for me. I think since I came into this world as a little, I've been doing therapy work or healing work in some way, and I think therapy kind of found me. And I just see it as being really in alignment with who I know myself to be and the work that I am seeking to do in the world.
So I think I hear you saying that the work of therapy connected with maybe just your own personal work that you have been doing for your whole life.
Yeah.
Nice.
I think part of that is because I am a marriage and family therapist. So I think systemically, I think about family systems and my place in my own family system, and the ways that family system across generations has kind of invited me to be who I am. which I'm really excited about. Cool. Thanks, like generations of family members calling me into this work.
Yeah.
And also, right, the world that I find myself in today. I feel like there's a place for my work in this world as it comes into the intersection of what's going on in people's lives in this moment in history. So, yeah.
Nice. Did you have any experience being a client in therapy before you became a therapist?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I worked with some just amazing individual therapists. I've gone to couples therapy. I've done a little bit of group therapy, and really just received a lot of healing, a lot of spaciousness for me to sit with my own self and to self-explore and to come more fully into knowledge of who I am and who I see myself being. And yeah, there's a little bit of that piece too of like, whoa, what a gift that this person has given me, and how do I extend this out? How do I keep this energy of like healing going forward?
I heard you say something just now that I think I know the answer to this, but I'll ask it anyway. Do you think that your experience as a client in therapy has helped you be a better therapist?
Absolutely. Yes. To this day, right. If I'm sitting with my therapist getting therapy, I'm like, oh my gosh, like there's all this stuff that like, I think I should, quote unquote, should know as a therapist, but it's like, no, just to like have the gift of my therapist, working with me on my stuff, has absolutely served me, because then I can turn it around and be like, oh wait, my therapist told me this. Maybe I can like, maybe this will work with my clients. And 9 times out of 10 it does. So there's just this like beautiful, like layered effect of like healers receiving healing, therapists receiving therapy that, absolutely, without a doubt, supports me in my work and encourages me to be the kind of therapist that I want to be.
This might be a little too in the weeds, but does your therapist practice the same modality that you practice?
No. So she is, well, I mean, in some ways. So my therapist is a licensed
Because I'm thinking
social
of like,
worker.
I'm gonna watch them do stuff and I'm gonna steal it and use it my own. But like, if it's not the same.
Yeah. I mean, we both do individual therapy. I mean, I do more, like I'll see couples or families also. So she, I think, primarily does individual work. And she's much more like trauma focused. So she does EMDR, which I don't do. So there are some ways that we're just very unique clinicians or therapists. But in some ways we have overlap, that feels just really, really beautiful and yummy.
I encountered something interesting like a month or so ago when I was interviewing somebody. Kelly Burke, very great, brilliant therapist in the EFT world. And as I was interviewing her, she said that she had not been to therapy before she became a therapist. And it like woke up this like bias that I had inside myself that I thought, oh, there's no way you could be a good therapist if you hadn't been to therapy. Like that's impossible, And from her perspective and her experience, she said, yeah, it kind of let me be in school a blank slate and kind of evaluate, everything without any bias towards any kind of, well, my therapist did this and, my therapist did that. And she's like, I could take it all in evenly and just kind of figure out what fit the best. And I was like, ugh, holy cow. Once again, I had this idea of something that was based on my personal experience that...
Yeah. Gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah. When I think sometimes like therapy in general gets this vibe of like, oh, like it's what you see in the movies or it's what so to be able to say like, no, I'm initiating like blank slate even in that regard. Like I'm tossing out even like preconceived notions of what therapy is or could be. I think that's really beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. My whole idea of what therapy was, I think, was based on Fraser Crane. And just, The Sopranos. But I think my idea, and I think part of the genesis of this show came through that, is a lot of my idea of what therapy was born out of pop culture. And that can it be helpful? I don't know. I think a lot of at least where I get my ideas from, it seems like it's not very helpful. And it certainly in my life and my journey to therapy made me scared to go to it. I remember having a conversation with a good friend of mine back in like 2008, something like that. And this was a guy who I respected greatly, like looked up to, admired, wanted to be like, and we were just having this normal conversation. And he said something along the lines of like, I don't remember what he said before, but it was like blah, 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 blah. And that's why I've been going to see a therapist for the past 2 months. And I was like, what? And I think I literally said in the moment, but you're not crazy. And he goes, yeah, I know. And I was like, why would you be going to a therapist then? And he said, well, if something goes wrong with your car, where do you take it? I was like, I don't know, like a mechanic. And he goes, yeah, why? It's like, well, I mean, because they know all about cars and how to work on them and how to make them do what they're supposed to do. He goes, yeah. So like a therapist is somebody who is an expert on how to help you process your emotions and your thoughts and how to help you get them to do what you want them to do. And I was like, huh. And then it was 5 years before I saw a therapist.
Oh, wow.
But honestly, when the time came, that conversation jumped to the forefront of my thoughts. And I just thought, if this person that I admired so much, if they were going to get help, then it seems like could be something that'd be useful for me as well.
Yeah. Gosh. Well, and that idea of, just destigmatizing like mental health in general, destigmatizing, well, so what, even if you are crazy, like there's nothing wrong with that, right?
Well, I think one thing that I recognized after that conversation, after the fact, was crazy tends to be kind of a catch-all dismissive word. Like for if we don't understand something or if somebody who we're in relationship with is maybe behaving in a way that we don't like or want or appreciate or, whatever.
Yeah. Well, I think that brings up a really important point, and this is something that I see a lot with the clients that I work with, this idea of like intersecting oppressions, that there's like a gendered like piece of it around like a misogynistic piece around saying like men calling women crazy is a way to like dismiss and discount women, especially like women's feelings. And also that intersects with this idea of like ableism. I spent a lot of time being in community with like the disability justice community and talking about the ways that, we think about the ways that like ableism also comes into play of telling like if you're crazy that's like an ableist like slur, right, that people use when it's like, okay, yeah, like people are disabled by their like mental health diagnoses and like, cool, that's okay. That's a part of what it means to be alive in the world for them. And that those like oppressions can intersect in that way, that it's like, oh, we'll just take a little bit of like misogyny and patriarchy and we'll take a little bit of ableism and we'll use it in these ways to like discredit, discount, dehumanize people.
What a terrible recipe.
Gosh, right? And it happens all the time. So that's part of like the work that I do with my clients is to like visibilize when that's happening and unpack that. And to like remove blame, to remove shame, to do those kinds of, to do that work of resisting kind of death dealing
to help build resilience.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so in my work as a client, one of the things that I think was needed in my life, and one of the things that we did was like in a relationship where I may have said somebody was crazy, to look at my behaviors in the relationship and the message that I was sending out, or I should say messages that I was sending out, and how, if my words are saying one thing and my actions are saying another, then it is going to confuse somebody and potentially throw them off balance. Wow.
Yeah. Yes.
throw them off balance to where, and with any of us, if we feel off balance, if we feel like the way that I understand the world and people and relationships is not congruent with the way that this is playing out, of course you're going to respond in a way that maybe is unstructured, that is maybe not congruent with how you would respond in other ways. And so for, me or anybody else to look at somebody and say, oh, they're crazy, but to also not look at what they're putting into the relationship, what they're putting into that experience between the two people, I think is dismissive at best, dehumanizing at worst. And it was just something to where, I think that the revelation to me of, a relationship, it always has two parts. I think up until then, I hate to say, which, like I said, this was years and years ago, I don't think I'd ever thought about. I don't think I'd ever been taught. I don't think, so for me, at least, therapy was this revelatory, and I'm an MFT too. And that's the reason why I went MFT, was because, when I got into therapy, it was because a relationship was surfacing something in me that was deeper than the relationship, but that was contributing to it. And so I went MFT because I thought, if you end up on the couch, it's either because of a relationship or something that's coming up from a relationship. And so let me get into that systemic thinking, let me get into the relationship thing so I can kind of help work all of that stuff out.
Yeah. Well, I would think about anxiety and depression and kind of the ways that we feel off, maybe like in our moods. I think about it in those terms of feeling out of alignment. Yeah. That if we like say one thing, but we do something else, or if we believe one thing, but we, act in a different way, when we're out of alignment in that way, I do believe that means that we're, stepping out of our integrity. We're out of our alignment, and that of course we're going to feel anxious, right? Of course we're going to feel disoriented, out of balance. So I do see that also as a part of my work as a therapist, is to, again, visibilize, when are we feeling out of alignment? What's that about? And like, how might we get back into alignment, back into our own integrity, back into our full dignity, as people, if we can, right?
Yeah.
We also live in a world that is, for some people, depending on how they show up with the different identities that they have, the world is working against folks being into their full identity and their full integrity. So, part of my work I see is harm reduction. Like, how do we reduce the harm that shows up when folks feel out of alignment, either because of outside or inside forces? So again, how do we reduce the distress? And part of that work is to step into alignment when we can.
Yeah. I think that, so one of the questions that I showed up at my therapist's office with, and like I said, like a relationship was surfacing something deeper, was at the time I felt like in my head and in my heart, I was saying, I believe one thing. In my actions, I was doing something that was counter to that belief. And as best I could work it out in myself at the time, the question that came to the surface was, what matters more, what I believe or what I do? And so like I showed up at therapy with that question because I thought I was thinking in this like binary, it's got to be one or the other way, where, in truth, it's more like an infinity symbol that they both contribute, to the other. And it was something I really wrestled with. And I like what you said about, being out of alignment, because I think at that time that would have described me perfectly. Was I had this belief system that was kind of leaning one way, but my actions were leaning another. And, I was trying to figure out which mattered more, because the deeper question that I was really trying to get to was, I feel ashamed. And so am I a good person or a bad person?
Wow.
Like, because I say that I believe one thing, but I do this other thing. And so which matters more, because that's going to determine what I think about myself.
Right.
When that was the wrong question to be asking, which that was the work. That was all of the work.
Yeah.
But I think that leads us kind of into a perfect transition into talking about the movie. What movie did you bring for us to talk about today?
So today I wanted to talk about The Miseducation of Cameron Post, which is a movie that just came out in 2018.
Yeah.
So it's pretty new.
I get into the weeds a little bit on the details of the movies, which, depending upon the timing of when I do that, doesn't sit well with Leigh-Ann, my wife, because she may still be in the emotional space of the movie. And I'm like, look at this director and what they've done and blah, 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 like that kind of thing. But I think one of the interesting things to me, and I'm going to do a little bit of weeds and we're jumping right in, that I found out was it won the grand jury prize at Sundance. It is the only movie in something like 59 years that won that prize and didn't get picked up for distribution immediately.
Wow.
It had a release nationwide in theaters at only 85 theaters.
Yeah.
And then it was done. Like the theatrical run of it was done. Mm-hmm. And watching the movie, I could definitely see why studios would be scared to put it out. Especially, in markets where it could be looked at as a movie that challenges how people think and what they do. Mm-hmm. But that's my whole weeds thing. I just thought that was really interesting because I there's a couple of movies that we've done on the show that I feel like are such great discussion starters for presenting, hey, you may say that you think or believe one way, but let's take a look at what your thoughts and beliefs could be contributing to in the experience of another person. Mm-hmm. And by looking at that and being confronted with that, let's talk about that belief. Let's talk about that thought and see what the implications of it are. Does it hold up? Does it do anything for you? Does it serve you in any way? Yeah. And I think that this is one of those movies where, it can just be a tremendous starter for discussion.
Yeah.
So why'd you pick it?
I was really struck. I saw this movie at the Belcourt, which apparently was one of those 85 places that it was shown. But I saw this movie at the Belcourt when it came out.
Had you seen a trailer? I had not, until you said the name, I'd never heard of it.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Yeah. I saw a trailer for it and I was like, okay, I think this will be a difficult but important movie for me to consume. And yeah, just watched a trailer about it and it's like, okay, I'm gonna go see this. So I went, saw the movie, and it was one of those movies that just stuck with me. I know it's a good movie or a movie that really affects me if I'm thinking about it days and weeks afterwards. And
that's just a good story. Any story is good if it's still with you, because I think that means that there's some universal thing in it that hits you and connects with you. Not necessarily that you've lived the story, no matter what it is, but just that there's something in it that you can identify with.
Absolutely. Yeah. And for me, I think this hit like a personal note. I am a queer person. I identify as trans, non-binary, and queer. So for me, it kind of struck that personal note of like, oh, wow, like this is something that was going down in the early 90s, right, for folks.
93 was when it was set,
93, yeah, which is at the height of kind of this wave of conversion therapy. I put that in quotes, right? Conversion interventions that were really being driven by like Christian fundamentalist circles. So it was kind of like right at the height of that trend. So it hit me on like a personal note, but then also on a like professional note. This movie was like, oh my gosh, like as a therapist, like how do I consume this movie as someone who saw interventions that seemed like really well intentioned, and even some interventions that I might use, right? Like, tell me who this reminds you of from your past, right? Like that's a story that that's a question that one of the therapists asks in the movie. I'm like, oh, I ask clients that sometimes. But then, thinking about bigger ethical questions as a clinician, as a therapist, and how did this movie bring up those questions for me? Questions around non-maleficence, doing no harm, of wanting to celebrate clients and their own autonomy and efficacy. So yeah, just being able to sit with all of those questions from a therapeutic lens too, But yeah, and I also, I mean, again, maybe on more of a personal note, but I have friends who were exposed to these types of interventions as young teens, and really just wanting to wrestle with some of these questions. And I think, I'm a theological thinker. I've been trained to think theologically and thinking about the ways that, again, intersecting oppressions, the ways that like sometimes those are amplified by institutions like the church, and how, there can be these tricky overlaps between like therapy and faith, and what those conversations look like and what are the intentions there.
What are the intentions, I think, is a really, really great question to ask. I think that was something that came up for me a lot watching the movie was, the story revolves around, Cameron being sent to, I don't know what you would call it, inpatient therapy facility.
Yeah.
Like I guess I hesitate to call it like a group home,
Right.
but it was clearly, teenagers were the population. I don't think, did they ever say where it was located, kind of set in the...
I didn't see...
It looked wildernessy.
I know. For some reason in my mind, I placed it in like... Oh, this is very interesting. I'm from Pennsylvania, so I placed it in my home state or somewhere, like Ohio,
I think for me, I placed it in Colorado.
Wow.
But only because of what I know is an association between Focus on the Family and James Dobson and conversion therapy. Like, I just in my head maybe connected those things and like was like, oh yeah, it's in Colorado. That's where that's at.
Yeah,
but I don't know
wild.
why.
And maybe that's like a beautiful thing about this movie is that it is kind of wildernessy. It is kind of placeless in this way of like, we know it's America. Like I didn't place it in the South because I didn't hear accents, right? I didn't place it, in other, it is kind of just this placelessness.
It lets you project in a good way a little. So Cameron is sent to this facility after she is discovered at her prom, ? By her, she called him her boyfriend.
Right.
She was there with him as a prom date, and at some point during the prom, she sneaks out and is making out in a car with another girl. And so I'm imagining, because they didn't really fill this in, I'm imagining that the boyfriend said something to somebody at the school who probably talked to her guardian, who I think is her aunt.
Right, her aunt.
Because her parents had died.
Right.
And then she is sent to this facility, I would assume, for conversion therapy to get rid of the gay, quote unquote.
Right.
And then while there, it's run by Dr. Lydia Marsh is the character's name, who is a therapist, and her brother, Rick, who it sounds like was her patient zero.
Her brother.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Was like, he quote unquote struggled with the same thing that these teens are struggling with. And she did interventions or therapy on him, which ethical violation right there.
Right.
And helped him kind of rid himself of these things that he didn't want. And seeing that it worked on him, opened it up to others. So Cameron is sent there. And I think that, getting back to what we were saying about what are the intentions, one of the first things I was struggling with is it seems like that Dr. Marsh's intentions are to, I'm going to say at best, reproduce in her clients herself. Reinforce the values, beliefs, system of thinking that she has in these teenagers. At worst, I'm going to say that it is in teaching them that the way you think and the things that you do and the way you are is wrong, and that you need to stop and get rid of that and be and do something else.
Yeah, she uses language like that her patients, these vulnerable teenagers under like her care have like gender confusion. That's language that comes up a lot.
Oh yeah, and like the first time she meets Cameron,
Yeah.
she says something like Cameron, and Cameron's like, you can call me Cam, and she goes, no, Cameron's already a masculine name. We don't need to shorten that to make it even more masculine.
Right. To contribute to your gender confusion.
Yes.
Right. So very clearly, like early on, we learned that like what's her name?
Marsh.
Dr. Marsh. Right. Yeah. Has some has a paradigm around how she understands like gender and sexuality, which, like we know today, like that's just not how gender works or sexuality works. Right. That it's.
Well, okay, so that's interesting. So I always am trying my best to be cognizant of the show is not for therapists. The show is for lay people.
Mm-hmm.
So could you, in a concise way, just talk about the difference between gender and sexuality?
Sure, absolutely. And I think we also have to talk about sex too. So
Yes.
like sex, gender, and sexuality. So for a lot of folks, it's important to parse these out. That sex really it refers to like our chromosomes, and it refers to like how we are medicalized, like when we're born into this world. And usually that's by doctors like looking at our genitalia. So sex are, under the medical model, we're either identified as like male or female, or sometimes intersex, depending on the situation for certain folks. But then gender is really how we show up in the world. It's a social construct, and so that's how we present to the world. And a more binary model would say, well, we either show up as men or women. But of course, we know that those binaries don't exist, that there's a lot of ways that folks show up in the world. Some show up as transgender, as agender, as non-binary, like myself. So resisting the gender binary. And then, of course, that also opens up conversations around gender expression, and how folks perform gender.
Could you say that gender is how a person thinks about themselves?
I think so. Yeah, I think gender is a conversation that folks have with themselves and also with other folks, like within society. Absolutely. Yeah. And that we all get to have the opportunity to explore what our gender is. And for some folks, it aligns with the sex we were assigned at birth. So those would be like cisgender people. And then for other folks, it's not as linear, or it's not as like one-to-one. So for some folks, they are like, no, I'm trans, and I want to like, participate in like gender affirming surgeries or hormones or things like that. And then for other folks, there might just be other ways. Like that's the beautiful thing. There's an infinite amount of ways to express gender and to claim gender. So there's an infinite number of genders, which I think is beautiful.
Yeah.
And then sexuality, right, is who we're attracted to, right? Like our sexual orientation is just who we want to be in sexual relationships with, if anyone, right? Some folks identify as asexual. Some people are heterosexual or bisexual. Some people are gay or lesbian. And there's debate around like, well, how does gender impact like sexuality or sexual orientation? And I think a lot of folks try to say, well, those are separate, right? We can talk about gender or we can talk about sexual orientation. And I think for the most part that's accurate, but we can't, there is overlap in terms of like how we understand ourselves, and our gender does come into effect to how we like identify or how we self narrate our sexual orientation. So yeah. So for me, I identify, so my like sex, like the sex or that I was assigned at birth, I was assigned female at birth. For my gender, I identify as trans, non-binary.
You said in kind of listing out several things before, I think you said agendered.
Yeah.
I don't think I've heard that before.
Oh, yeah.
How is that different?
So as I understand it, some folks identify as agender, or just not having a specific gender that they ascribe to.
Is that not the same as non-binary?
So not as I understand it. And I think maybe it also just depends on who is claiming that label for themselves and being able to like ask them. So as someone who does not identify as agender, I'm not like the expert on what that means for folks. but I think about it as like being like without gender, right? That like gender may not be applicable to that person in a way that it might be applicable or like really important to other people. So that's how I understand agender. Whereas non-binary for me is saying, oh no, like I have gender, right? I have gender. I'm doing a gender performance. It just lives outside of this gender binary, right? And that I'm not even saying that, oh, I'm a little bit of both, right? Because even saying both implies that there's two genders. I'm like, well, actually, like I'm neither, and I maybe transcend gender, and I think that's really cool. But again, like that's me languaging my gender experience for you, and I think that's again speaks to that infinite amount of ways that gender is unique to each person.
Yeah.
So it's a really important thing for me as a therapist to ask folks if it's alive in the therapy room. How do you understand your gender? How does that like show up in the world? Who is affirming you and who isn't? And just staying curious about all of that. Yeah. And then of course, right, that's just conversations about gender. And then, you know, sexuality, it brings in this like relational piece. Like, who do you love? Like, how is that? How are you being affirmed in the world in that way? Or not? So I use the word for myself. I use the word queer to identify like my sexual orientation, which has flavors of being like bisexual, pansexual, but also affirming that like as a trans person, I am like particularly attracted to other trans people, which I don't know if there's a word for that. So I just say queer.
Yeah.
But yeah. And queer has connotations. You know, my dad grew up in the 40s, and you know, for him growing up, queer was always like a slur that people, you know, would say to each other, throw at each other.
But what's interesting is if you go just a little bit farther back than that, you see it showing up in a lot of C.S. Lewis's writing, just to describe strange or different, but not in a kind of other or negative way, just in a, oh, I haven't seen something like this before. This is queer. Like,
Yes.
you know, and
Yes.
it, you know, and I think I was saying something to Leigh-Ann not too long ago of, oh, I wonder where that terminology kind of switched from this kind of innocent, I'm observing something I haven't observed before, to a negative pronouncement over a person.
Yeah. Yeah. The way slurs like emerge is like fascinating, right? My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, right? Robert Frost like uses that word in this just really beautiful way.
Yeah.
And then somehow it became pejorative, it became a slur, and then it became reclaimed, right? So that word became reclaimed by folks.
Or even the word gay, like you see it show up in Christmas carols.
Yes, right?
And then you go, this is something that became something people spray painted on, you know, places to make people feel, you know, not wanted.
Absolutely. It became this code for intimidation, threats of violence, threats of, I mean, all kinds of stuff. Yeah.
I think that one of the biggest things that I learned in my personal work, and that I continue to learn, and hopefully, because I'm trying, give space to in my therapeutic work with clients, is something that you said of when you were talking about binary and now we know that the binary doesn't exist. I think that, you know, my way of thinking or conceptualizing or understanding the world, and not just in the terms of binary genders, but in everything many years ago, was there's a binary in everything. Like there is a black and a white, there is a right and a wrong, there's a good and a bad, and everything is going to fit into one of two categories. Right. And then in my own work as a client, what I discovered was, oh, there's a much richer palette than just black or white. And I usually conceptualize it now as living in the gray. And of course, I could come up with a better metaphor, and there's many more colors, but like, you know, that's just the shorthand in my brain.
Yeah.
But what I try to do with my clients is to just give room for, you know, where do you want your particular pin in the story that we're talking about right now to sit? Because it doesn't have to be one or two. It doesn't have to be black or white. And a lot of times, because I work primarily with addicts, one of the first things we do is just recognize that what they're wrestling with, and it's something similar to what I said I wrestled with, was I'm trying to figure out, based upon my conceptualization, if I'm good or bad. And so for me, just even kind of hearing you say like, yeah, the binary doesn't exist, I think that's such a giant, general, universal, like on so many levels, especially in the context of this movie, sexuality, gender, sex, I think it's true. I loved the way I think about, I don't know when it was in the movie, maybe halfway through, but Adam describes himself as two-spirited,
Oh, yeah.
which I have only seen show up in context of Native American culture. I haven't
Yeah.
seen that described anywhere else, but that's just, doesn't mean it isn't. That just means that's where I've seen it.
Well, it actually isn't, right? So as I understand it, two-spirit really is a gender like identity that is reserved for Indigenous people. So yeah, like me as a white person to claim a two-spirit identity would actually be like super not appropriate. And yeah, just yeah. And I think I love the concept of two-spirit, and in this way that we can think about decolonizing gender, that so often,
I need to sit with
right,
that for a sec.
right?
Decolonizing gender.
Yes, the
Wow.
ways that like colonization, as another one of these like systems of oppression, colonization used the gender binary, used the separation of folks into two boxes of gender as a way to control, as a way to colonize, take over, extract resources from, and honestly to kill, right? To eradicate cultures. But before colonization happened on this continent and in other places, gender for Indigenous folks was much more fluid. The Navajo have 4 genders, right? This idea of two-spirit is a way of honoring that, like, yeah, that absolutely no, like gender is not a binary, and we know that, right? Because we can also just think, even if folks come back with the argument of like, well, biologically, it's like, no, not even biologically do we have two sexes, right?
Yeah.
That folks are born intersex, and that there is variance across gender, sexuality, sex.
Yeah. So the first project I did in grad school for Dr. Hopkins in lifespan development, you know, she allowed us to group up and then just pick something about lifespan, like something in the lifespan, and do a thing on it. And so I said to myself, because I'm a glutton for punishment, I want to do the hardest thing I can think of. So I picked, how do we develop our gender identity?
Ooh.
And I drug 3 other people in with me. And one of the things that I think I was surprised to see is what you described earlier as a doctor really assigns you a sex at birth. And I was surprised to see in research that research bears out that medically there are not even 2 specific sexes when a person is born. Sometimes, you know, people are born with their exterior genitals looking one of 2 ways. Sometimes they are born not looking one of 2 ways. And sometimes even the interior reproductive system, there are more than one set present.
Absolutely.
And how when a doctor helps a woman give birth to a child, a doctor looks at the child and with his best guess assigns it a sex. And I think I was really, you know, that really does challenge because we're not present in every birth room. Like, so what we believe about that kind of thing is really just kind of what we've been handed down, what we've been told. And so to see that, and then I came across this research article in the Dominican Republic. I want to say this was sometime in the late 80s, early 90s. What they found was there was when I say large group, I mean something along the lines of 20 or something, group of female children who all of a sudden in their teenage years, as they went through puberty, grew penises and began, you know, identifying as male. And they were like, well, they're not the frogs from Jurassic Park. So what is going on here? And it was just this kind of like they had been born with hormones that, you know, some were present, some were not present. And then as they went through puberty, that balance shifted, and their bodies developed, and they began to experience things that caused them to identify in a different way. Mm-hmm. And so I think, even just in that project, it was like, and of course at, the grad school that we went to at Trevecca, each class lasts 6 weeks. And so just kind of recognizing I would love to spend so much more time than the 1 week that I got a chance to spend on this,
Yeah.
But just going back to what we were saying again, binaries not really being a thing. It's just a construct that we came up with, I don't know, hundreds of years ago, thousands of, I don't know when it was, but certainly something that had been handed back down.
Yeah, well, in cognitive behavioral therapy, right, it invites us to realize that black and white thinking, all or nothing thinking is a cognitive distortion, right? And that you're right. Like if we're working with clients who are operating out of this all or nothing way of thinking, that is our work, to try to invite folks to find this middle ground, to find the gray, like you said.
To be okay in the gray.
Yeah.
Copyright.
And it's like, right? Like if we're inviting folks to do that in ways that, and we're acknowledging that type of thinking is a cognitive distortion, right? That comes right out of cognitive behavioral therapy. Then we need to acknowledge all of the ways that like these binaries, these all or nothing ways of thinking really don't serve us.
Yeah.
That they limit our creativity.
I tried to introduce a client to that this past week, and I didn't use cognitive distortion. I just said unproductive way of thinking.
Unhelpful thinking style.
Yeah. Which is the same thing.
Yep.
But yeah, black or white thinking, is it like anything else? I think it's fair to say, is this serving you? Is this working for you? Or is there maybe something else that could work better?
Yeah. And like, what might you be afraid to find if you move into the gray? Right. And I think that is like where this work becomes really heart work, like courageous work of saying, how do I sit with fear of what might be in the in-between and move toward that with courage? And sometimes folks need a therapist to hold their hand and say, like, we're going there.
Literally and figuratively.
Yes. Like, we are going there, and, like, fear not, right?
And you're not going there alone.
Yeah.
I'm going there with you. And that's really, like I mentioned when I came into therapy and I had what matters more. That's really what was happening in me, was I had this foundation, this worldview that I felt like couldn't hold up with what was being worked out and challenged in my life. And for me, the fear was, if I wade into that gray, does that worldview get demolished and everything that I know to be true then go away? And that was, for a person who the unknown is scary in and of itself, to take everything you've known and potentially lose that is the scariest thing. Yeah. And so I am so glad that I had the therapist that I had, who was so compassionate and patient and graceful and what's a good word for somebody that sticks with you? I don't know. He was a great companion to like walk through that with. And it made me a better person, all of that work, and a better therapist. So, we go back to Dr. Marsh and the intentions. It seemed like she was just trying to make a bunch of baby Marshes.
Yeah.
Martians? Could that be her
Little
fans?
Martians.
Oh, nice. Not nice, because she was a terrible person. But
no, this idea of conformity, though, I think is really important to bring up. The ways, like, right, I also love the term to self-identify as being gender nonconforming, right? And to understand that, in this movie, there was such a move toward conforming to a cisnormativity, being cisgender, conforming to heteronormativity, like that being heterosexual is the norm, that being cisgender is the norm, that creating cultures of conformity absolutely show up in certain cultures, right, in our country, and maybe even in our families of origin. I also saw Dr. Marsh as someone who like was practicing she was authoritarian. In a way, like,
I got a really big Handmaid's Tale vibe from her.
Yeah, she was scary, right? Like there was an element of control that crosses, as therapists, we want to like be able to hold structure in the therapy room. And that's our role, right? To hold structure. She was wielding a little bit more than structure, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, why do we hold structure? We hold it because boundaries are helpful. I always kind of conceptualize it as I'm just going to be the bumpers in the bowling alley just to help you get to where you're trying to go.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to try to contain you. I'm not going to try to control you. I'm just going to kind of help keep us within the lane. Whereas with her, I felt like it was more along the lines of she was trying to be a cookie cutter. Like she wanted them to look like, no, I'm not boundaries. I am the definition, and you will be this way. You will do what I say you will do.
Right. And that brings me to a point of really thinking about like, how do we hold space for other people? And this is like a framework that I really like to use. And it's a framework that was taught to me by a transgender educator who lives in California named Beck G. Cohen. And Beck talks about this idea that there are like levels of how we experience people, or how we experience environments, or maybe even how we receive love. And that kind of maybe the first tier or level, I don't even know if it's linear, it's flexible, but one level is rejection, right? We're told basically like, I don't love you. You're not welcome here. Like we are cut off from one another. The next level, maybe a tier above that, is this idea of, it's not quite rejection, it's tolerance. So I can tolerate you, right? I tolerate you in spite of fill in the blank. I love you in spite of
Maybe
fill in the
like,
blank.
I don't necessarily like you, but I will coexist with you.
Yeah,
Is
sure. Yeah. So that's one way to be received by someone else, or to be in relationship with someone else. Might not feel super great. At least it doesn't for me. I'll speak for myself. So rejection, tolerance, then we have acceptance, right? This idea of I like you or I love you even though. So there's still kind of a qualifier there. Even though you are blank, we're down, like we're in relationship or whatever. I love you even though.
Which the phrase like, I love you in spite of kind of comes to mind. Like even in the affirmation, still the reminder of the thing.
The condition.
Yeah.
So I like to think about kind of that next level up, which I mentioned earlier today, affirmation, right? An affirmation tells us, I love you because you are blank. And this idea of speaking to like the goodness in folks, and saying like, because you are fill in the blank, I love you.
My supervisor called that celebration. And
Gosh, right?
Something lit up in me when she said that word, like, oh, yes, I like that.
Oh my gosh, it's crucial.
Yeah.
Right. That's where I think we feel safe, where we feel like we can really connect. Everything below affirmation kind of feels conditional. There's a quality to it that doesn't quite feel like, oh, like I can bring all parts of myself here. Which is what I heard you say in terms of like how you want to show up with your clients who might be trying to put themselves in this like bad person, good person box. It's like, hold on, you're a human being. And because you are a human being, like I'm here with you.
You're more complex than just two possible choices.
I love you because you are complex.
Yes.
Right? I am in relationship with you because you are nuanced, and right, to be able to hold, how can we affirm folks and meet them there? So I think about that absolutely in the context of gender and sexuality, right? In what places and spaces are queer folk being affirmed, that they're not told, yeah, come on in here, like come on in, have a seat, even though you're, queer, or even though you're trans or whatever. That it's really, no, like you, like because you are queer and trans, you are welcome, wanted, needed, celebrated here. That level of affirmation, I think is just so crucial. And I don't know if there are a lot of like spaces. I mean, clearly, right, God's promise where Cameron went was not, right. I think it was probably like rejection when it comes to like that level of understanding like gender and sexuality. Maybe tolerating in terms of like teens, right? I saw a lot of like ageism like throughout the movie, this idea of like, oh, they're teens. The pastor at the very beginning of the movie says teens are particularly vulnerable to evil, right? So thinking about the ways that like teens are like looked down upon and disparaged, whereas
Yeah.
rather like to have an affirming culture around teens would be to say like, we love you because you are teens, because you have important things to say in the world
Yeah.
about what it means to be in this particular phase of life.
Yeah, that's some ageism showing up. I watched yesterday. We're still in the process of packing boxes at our house, and so like at some point yesterday, I just got to that work. But I had my phone set up with Netflix on it, and I was watching Russell Brand's comedy special that just came out. And at one point, he talks about the birth of his first daughter, and just kind of realizing how though she was a baby at the time, he was still a baby, and he gets to this point where he says, then I had this realization that we're all just babies. Like, you're a baby, you're a baby, you're a baby. And he was saying that in the sense of none of us know anything for sure. We're all just taking our best stab at it. Like, we're all vulnerable. We all need comfort. We all need protection. We all need to belong. Yeah. And because of that, we're all the same. And, you know, definitely at that part there, with that pastor saying that, there was this, well, you don't know. I know because I have crossed the threshold of this particular age that will be forever not definable.
Yeah.
And I am now an adult. And I think I said a couple of weeks ago on a show, and I said it to somebody out in the world this week, like, you know, when I was a kid, I thought that I would get to a place as an adult where I knew, no matter what it was, like, that I would know I would be full of this, like, assurance and certainty. And you know, then as you wade into adulthood, you just find out, like, I don't know, like, I'm just trying my best. Like,
Yeah.
I may know certain stuff that I may enforce upon my kid if I have a kid one day, like, don't stick a fork in an electrical outlet, like,
Don't do it.
you know, don't eat just Smarties at every meal, for, you know, but that's different. I mean, that's just because, you know, hey, your teeth will rot out and you'll die.
That's holding
Like,
structure, right?
Yeah,
Like we talked about.
yeah. But when it comes to, you know, personal kinds of things, we're all just taking our best stab at it.
Yeah.
One thing that you said something a few minutes ago about Dr. Marsh and how she seemed very authoritative. I don't know if I know the difference. Yes, I do. Authoritarian is separate. Authoritative is structured, but with. Very authoritarian, and it made me think of the contrast between her and Rick, and how it seemed like Rick was somebody who, while still adopting the way of thinking of Dr. Marsh, was with the teenagers. Like, I remember he showed up and had breakfast with them one morning.
Right.
He would sit down with them and talk with them a lot. And I wonder if that was intentional in the minds of the characters. Like, if it was like Dr. Marsh was I'm just going to show up on campus from 9 to 5 and do these interventions, and Rick is going to live there and be with them kind of thing. Or if it was just maybe because he had been her patient zero, that he kind of had a little more empathy for what they were going through. And I even think about the time where he had the conversation with Cameron, and she challenged how he in his saying, I don't know, broke down because it was a challenge to that worldview, and it was a challenge to how he was conceptualizing everything. And to have that challenged was too much for him to bear in that moment.
Yeah. I often, like, throughout watching the movie, thought about Rick as a teenager. And I don't know if that's me just going into, like, you know, therapist brain, thinking about, like, the ways that doing gender exploration and sexual orientation exploration is a developmental task. And if we are denied the ability to do that, we do have a little bit of arrested development, in the sense of, like, oh gosh, like, Reverend Rick, like, didn't get an opportunity to really explore who he was in affirming ways that say whoever you end up being or whoever you find yourself to be, welcome, you are wanted, loved, celebrated. And that because of that, right, there is kind of this way of reading him throughout the movie as being a little bit of, like, like a teen, or someone who wants to be relevant to teens, which I think like comes up a lot, which it can be like a really like well-intentioned gesture. We see that, right? Like youth pastors in like this world kind of sometimes take that well-intentioned gesture of like, I want to celebrate teens.
Yeah. Oh, no, I thought about the denim long sleeve shirt and the acoustic guitar. I was like, oh.
Right? The danger is that it like veers into like paternalism, right? This
Yeah.
idea of like, I know better, like, let me help you out, rather than like, tell me what wisdom you have as a teen doing really important developmental tasks right now. Tell me what wisdom you have about who you are and what this world is about. And that's a very different posture to take.
It is, yeah. It reminds me of everything that I say comes back to addiction at some point in time, but it reminds me of that in that, the addiction isn't the problem. The addiction is the solution that they are turning to because whatever distress that they're experiencing, they're turning to the addiction as a way of coping with the world. And so rather than going about it as, well, we just have to get rid of that, that would be experiencing the addiction as the problem. But if you look at it as the solution, it allows you to go to a deeper level. And I think, in here, they were taking that same approach. Like this reason they were sent to this facility is a problem, and I realize even now as I'm saying this, I'm putting it in a category that is not the same. Addiction is not the same as what's going on in this movie. I don't want to associate those things together. But what I mean is both Rick and Dr. I've already forgotten it, Marsh, we're looking at it as you are doing a thing that is bad, quote unquote, and we need to get rid of the bad, quote unquote, behavior, when that is not at all what was happening. They could have been experiencing distress because who they are as a person and as it was coming out in the system that they were in conflicted with what the system believed should have been. But that approaching it that way is completely different than approaching it from the way they were approaching it.
Yeah.
And I think Rick got a step farther than Dr. Marsh because at least he wasn't afraid, or maybe he was at least willing to be with. So that's something. But even then, I think you're right. He still was coming off as, hey, come with me in the direction of this thing that I think is better, rather than, my mind is a little bit blown about what you just said about inviting them to say, what wisdom do you have? What's coming from you from where you're at? Which I think, invites them to bring their worldview to the table. And I think where I was trying to go with the problem and the solution was, what's maybe inviting them, what's going on inside of you and how are you addressing it right now? And is that working for you? Or, is it not working? And we need to find something that does work. But even then, it's we need to find something, not I've got this thing that's going to work and you should do it.
Gosh, it makes me think about the whole iceberg, the whole metaphor of the iceberg. And
Such
fill out your iceberg.
maybe good
kids.
intentions.
Right? Like,
but maybe not.
Gosh, right. It's like, tell us what's wrong with you, right? Was basically how that intervention unfolded.
Hey, everybody. This is Josh, and I'm interrupting the episode to ask for your help in getting more people into the theater. I'd love to see Therapist Theater make a dent on the iTunes podcast lists, and the best way to do that is by giving it a 5-star rating and a 5-star review. You can do that by visiting the show's page in the podcast app. It helps by increasing the show's visibility in the app and by letting others know what to expect when they're thinking of listening. Thanks so much for being with us, and thanks so much for helping to spread the word about Therapist Theater. Okay, back to the show.
Yeah, rather than like, well, what, I also think about the context of this movie, right? 1993, timeline-wise, like homosexuality, and I'm putting that in air quotes, right, was taken out of the DSM, right, in 1979. So just thinking about just timeline. With
Wait, it was in the DSM?
Yes. So in the DSM 3, I think, or maybe it was taken out of the DSM 3. You might need to check that. But I'm pretty sure it was 1973. Haha, I wrote it down. 1973, homosexuality was removed from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the manual that like therapists use to diagnose folks with mental health
Disorders.
Sure. Yes. And in that way, right, I have a complicated relationship with diagnosis in general. I think
Like any
diagnosing
good
folks,
MFT would.
right,
Like we
right,
all
like
have
diagnosing
that.
folks can be a helpful tool. I never want it to be pathologizing.
Yes.
And the ways that, right, homosexuality, quote unquote, I put that in air quotes because it's not really a term that folks should be using nowadays. But homosexuality, as it was written in the DSM, was removed in, early 70s, 73. And that was just, a couple years after the Stonewall riots in New York City in 1969. So just thinking about timeline, right? Like 69 Stonewall and like big, like gay rights activists coming into the world. 1973, that homosexuality is removed from the DSM.
4 years later.
Right. And then, right. So then after that, there's this conversation, right, that's happening around, well, what do we do with folks who are gay, right? What do we do with folks who are not gender normative in these ways? And of course, right, like who wants to have a say in this conversation? It's like fundamentalist, the Christian right, who get hundreds of thousands of dollars to do research to solve, quote unquote, solve the gay problem. It turns out, in 2012, Spitzer, who's one of the main researchers who was doing, research in the 80s and 90s, I think, basically like retracted all of his research saying, like none of this research that I did around interventions to try to make people not gay anymore. None of this is legitimate.
Could have just been filled with a bunch of confirmation bias. Like we're looking for this.
Right.
We found this.
Right. And also just playing off of folks, I imagine playing off of folks' fear of, why would I want to be gay in a world that is anything but affirming, right?
Yeah.
Like, why would I want to like step into that identity? So of course we have people programmed to hate themselves, right? Of course, like we have a society that is programming folks to hate themselves, a death-dealing culture around queer identity.
Culture.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, and then of course I think about, I don't think we can talk about, any of this without also talking about like suicide prevention, right? And this idea that like to have like queer affirming spaces is suicide prevention. To use people's pronouns is suicide prevention. To use people's preferred names is suicide prevention.
Well, and that, you mentioned kind of half the quote, in watching the movie towards the end, Cameron is having a discussion with, I think somebody from DSS, somebody that's been sent there to kind of evaluate, and it's after Mark harms himself, and that's what brings us in. But the person asks her, is this an abusive place? And she says something along the lines of, well, they feed us and they give us a place to stay. So in that sense, no. But she says, but then he asks about emotional abuse, and she says, yes. And how is programming people to hate themselves not emotionally abusive or emotional abuse? And so like I stood up, snapped my finger and said, yes, that's it. Because that to me is the hook that this whole thing hangs on. How is programming people to hate themselves not emotional abuse? And I think that is Dr. Marsh's MO, is it's teaching these kids not to look at a behavior as unproductive or productive, not to look at a behavior as a problem to be solved, not even that about identity, but it's to say, you as a person are wrong. You as a person are not correct, and you as a person are filled with something that you should look at with disdain and with hate, and with every fiber of your being seek to eliminate you as a person. And that manifested itself in Mark doing what he did. And so even what you're saying now about using proper pronouns, using a chosen name as suicide prevention just jives so completely, because you saw it manifest itself in the movie.
Absolutely.
And, I think too, we were talking about how when Cam showed up and Dr. Marsh like went right in on gender confusion. And I think to Mark and I think to Aaron, although like in this case, I don't think gender confusion is quite right with Mark, but like with Aaron, you know, she told a story to Cam of how she would sit and watch sports with her dad and get decked out in the team's gear and all this, and how Marsh was going in on that's why, you know, you are too masculine or something along those lines. Whereas with Mark, you know, I think that they showed like this little flashback scene of him, I want to say playing chess with his dad.
Yeah.
And he goes to cross his leg at the knee, but then like observes his dad and then moves his leg to where his ankle is on his knee. And then, you know, that kind of comes to a head in a group therapy session they're having where, you know, I guess he had written to his father and said, "Can I leave early?" And his father said something along the lines of, "You're still too feminine, and that is not a weakness I can tolerate in my house." And that, I mean, when I say it absolutely breaks him, it manifests in him quoting scripture in really like a fire and brimstone kind of shouty kind of way. And then getting down on the ground and doing push-ups because he's just got this like, in order to be loved by my dad, I've got to seem to be his idea of what masculine is and what masculine strength is, you know. And then Dr. Marsh puts her foot on his back and says, "You're not getting up until blah, blah, blah." And then he ends up, I think, it seemed trying to cut his penis off, and he pours bleach on the wound.
Yeah.
And as I was thinking about that, I thought about kind of the problem versus solution thing in how, in that case, and I've seen this happen a lot. I've heard it in a lot of people's stories of sex addiction. It's that undealt with or unprocessed or understood, to make up a word, shame from their actions, from what they believe is something outside of what they want. A person who's experiencing shame will typically gravitate towards feeling comfort in being able to blame something or someone. Because as humans, we don't like uncertainty. And to be able to have quote unquote certainty around something means, oh, I don't have to be in the unknown. I can be less scared. And so sometimes in sex addiction, an addict will blame their sex drive. They will blame their desire. They will blame their want for sexual expression on their distress. And in their mind, they get to a place of, well, if I just didn't have my genitals, then I wouldn't have to worry about feeling this way anymore. And, you know, and I think in Mark, it was a little bit deeper than that, because it wasn't just his genitals, but it was his dad also saying who you are as a person is wrong, you know, and it leads to him taking an action that is harming and damaging and drastic in his attempt to just be able to come home, to just be accepted by his dad. And it's something that quite naturally like rocks the community that the teenagers are in, and I think is what is the cause of the conversation between Cameron and Rick that just kind of breaks Rick. You know, and I think in that moment it's probably him realizing, oh, this is abusive. Like, this is not helpful.
Yeah, I think Cameron says something like, "You people don't know what you're doing. You're just making it up as you go."
Maybe that's it, as she says, do you know what you're doing? Like, is there... But gosh, the Mark thing just broke me. Like, that is just a heartbreaking... And I think especially, you know, coming from growing up in the church and a fundamentalist evangelical church that, you know, you're taught tons of binaries. You're taught tons of those, and you're taught that one side of it is safe and good and one side of it is not. And you could see that struggle within Mark of, this is what my dad is saying. I'm trying to do what dad is saying to do, but I'm still not good enough. Will I ever be good enough? If not, here's what I'm going to do.
Yeah, and that again plays into this idea of like, authority, right? Like who is able to like impose authority over us, and in what ways are we invited or encouraged as human beings to step into our own authority, and into our own, and I believe this, right, our own inherent goodness, and to be able to say like, oh wait, no, my body is good. Like how my body is showing up, how desire is manifesting itself in my body, whether that's desire for like people that look similar to me or not, right? Or, you know, my sex drive, like whatever it is, to be able to honor like the goodness of our bodies. And I think that is something that is a binary, right? In these worlds of fundamentalism that says like the body is bad, right? It kind of gets into the bad bucket.
Gnosticism, in that the spirit is good, but the body is bad.
Right? Yes. And to say, hold on, but what if we step outside of that binary and honor the ways that like our bodies are good? How do we acknowledge, I mean, they are so good, right? As therapists, we know that like our bodies are trying to keep us safe. When we go into trauma response, when we go into panic, when we go into fight or flight, our bodies are working so well to keep us safe. Our bodies are so good. And actually, that's another phrase that comes from the disability justice movement, this idea that all bodies are good bodies, and that what comes up, you know, in our bodies is to be noticed, to be acknowledged and honored, and perhaps even to be celebrated. Like, whoa, like my legs just got tingly because I like feel weird about the situation. Thanks, body, for letting me know. Like, I need to get out of here. You know, flight response shows up.
I think back to, you know, you mentioned earlier dignity.
Yes.
I have a friend in San Diego who operated a ministry out of the church I worked at, where every Friday night, him and a bunch of high schoolers would get together and make hundreds of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, go downtown and hand them out to homeless people. And I remember asking him one time, why? Like, it's a sandwich. Like, what? And he goes, it's not about the sandwich. He goes, do you know how many programs there are downtown that can feed them? Like, they're going to get better food there than a PB&J. He said, the PB&J is just a ticket. I was like, a ticket? And he said, yes. We give them the sandwich, and then we sit down on the sidewalk with them, and we talk with them. And he said, the ministry is not about feeding them. The ministry is about giving them their dignity back. Because so many times people walk by, and if they see them, they'll avert their eyes, or they'll try from the beginning to not look at them. And they don't acknowledge them as a person who is in their presence. Their personhood has been taken from them. And so what the ministry really is to give them back their dignity and their personhood by just showing up and acknowledging them and having a conversation with them.
Yeah.
If it leads to something more, great. If not, that's enough. That's something that they need.
I really appreciate that, right? Especially as like, I don't know, well, as therapists, right? We know that like to make eye contact with someone is like crucial. And it does like humanize, right? And you're right, like street-based folks are dehumanized, right? And I think that's a combination, you know, I have a lot of thoughts on the ways that we live in a world that disenfranchises people who are street-based. And thinking about all kinds of things like capitalism and like again, back to this idea of the stigma around mental health, right? Mental health stigmas.
Have you seen The Soloist?
Yes.
It's a great one for that.
I saw that in theaters back in the day. Yeah. Right. So, right. But this idea of dignity, of how do we honor all folks in their full dignity, saying all parts of you are welcome here, that you, that what you bring into this space, only you can bring, and that all parts are going to be affirmed, celebrated.
And not in spite of.
Right. Yeah. Or not, even though
Yeah.
It's like, we're taking it all the way to the top. We're taking it all to a way of affirming space. Because, right, all of that is the work to be able to say, okay, maybe I'm the first person ever to affirm you in where you're at right now, what's going on. Yeah.
So we've kind of gone all over the place. Let's get a little more back into it, just because I know that you prepped a lot for it. But like,
Yeah.
what else like sticks out to you, and stands out to you about the movie?
I think something.
Because we went from introducing Cameron to like,
Gosh,
wow, all over.
right?
Yeah.
Well, I think something that really stuck with me is the way that like some of the interventions used like in the movie, right, by Dr. Marsh are things, like I said, that would come out of my mouth like as a therapist, and being able to really like parse them out, like like we've said, parsing out the intentions are really important. But also, like, I think at one point Dr. Marsh says something like, what you get out of this, or like your progress, how does she put it? I wrote it down. Your progress is dependent on your participation. She says that to Cameron at one point. She senses that Cameron is a little bit like guarded in the process, hasn't quite done her iceberg or whatever. And there's this sense of like, well, Cameron, like your participation in this, will define how much progress you make. And part of me is like, oh gosh, like that is something that I might think or even say to a client.
Well, it's not true.
Right?
Yeah.
So just the understanding like the ways that like, right, like that this is kind of like slimy business, right? And to be able to really just invite listeners to notice like, okay, like what about this feels like what a therapist might do. They might say like, absolutely, like what you get out of this is going to be, what you put in is what you're going to get out. And like, we might go to some hard places around like your family of origin. We might dig into your relationship with your dad and those times where you sat down on the couch and bonded, right? Or when y'all played chess, we might go there. So there are things that like a therapist might do that were modeled in this movie. And I think it's really important to just bring all of us, all of our consciousness to the ways that like how those questions are asked, how those interventions are brought forward. It matters. It matters how they're brought. And my hope is that when folks are with a therapist, with their feeling out, like, is this a good fit or not? Do I feel that thing that Cameron felt where she kind of leaned back? Or am I leaning into this? I want folks to feel affirmed, right? I want them to feel like, oh, right, like I can bring all parts of myself. We're building trust maybe in the early stages with the therapist, and that's like natural. We want to just be building trust. Therapists call that the joining process. We're joining, we're building trust together. We're learning the client's story. But just something to listen to is this idea of like, am I being affirmed here? Am I being celebrated? Am I, being held right in this therapeutic space in a way that like invites me forward and that I don't feel shamed or blamed or judged.
And I like, you mentioned Cameron leaning back. I think that there's a way that we as therapists can ask things or state things that feels like we're leaning in. I don't feel like anything that Dr. Marsh was doing was her leaning in. I think it was her standing behind a protective barrier, like tossing things over a wall or something. Like she wasn't actually trying to step towards Cameron.
Right.
And I think that makes all the difference. In the joining process, like I'm always reminded, I had this client during the internship that showed up, and it was 4 sessions, 4 weeks of them saying, like, I don't know, and something else, but filler. And they came in saying, I'm here for this reason. But they never went near that reason for anything. And so I remember sitting with one of my supervisors and saying, I think I'm going to turn them loose because they're not doing anything. And it could be for whatever reason, but they're not. And then I think that was after week 3. Week 4, last 5 minutes of the session. Oh yeah. And I think I've been meaning to tell you that, I've had this 10-year addiction to porn. And I was like, oh my gosh, I was ready to cut this person loose, and all they were doing was trying to figure out if they could trust me
Yeah.
to tell me the hard thing.
Mm-hmm.
I experienced so much shame around that,
Whoa.
which, I mean, it was during my internship.
Sure.
Like,
The early days.
you know, I was
Yeah.
I was trying to figure out how to do, what to do, all that kind of stuff. But I
Yeah.
just remember thinking, I was ready to make a call on somebody when all they were trying to do was test the waters to see if it was safe to bring out the thing
Yeah.
that they were experiencing shame and fear around.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, even in that, you know, we see Dr. Marsh, she sits down and she, like, pulls out this iceberg thing right away and all this kind of stuff. Even in the joining process, to just give that space and just remember as a therapist that if we say that this is going to be relational, we have to give space for the relationship. And that may not be able to be accomplished in 1 session, 2 sessions, 3 sessions, however many. The person gets to determine when they trust us.
Yes.
And so we have to be willing to give them what they need, space-wise, time-wise, sometimes environment-wise, to trust us. Because if it's about the client and if we want to help them and if we want them to trust us, we have to let them do that on their terms.
Absolutely. And I love that. That's really making me think about just one of my general philosophies, like as a therapist, is I posture myself as someone who trusts that my client is the best expert on their life and they're the best expert on their body, right? So when they feel like comfortable in the space for us to go there, we'll go there, right? That readiness factor, like, are we ready to go there? Right? But like even the idea of like leaning in or leaning back, like that's our bodies telling us something. That's data that our bodies are telling us about, okay, what is this space like for me? Is this working? Is this not? I ask my clients at the end of every first session that I have with them, does this feel like a good fit? Right? Not do you think this is a good fit, but does this feel like a good fit? Do you intuit that this is a place where you can do the work that you think you want to do as the expert on your life and your body? And sometimes the answer is yeah. Sometimes the answer is I don't know. Sometimes it's, I don't think so. And it's like, great. You are the expert. Thank you for advocating for yourself, asking for what you need. And even in that, right, affirmation. I'm affirming, like, awesome. Thank you for letting me know what you need.
Yeah.
And that's just an open policy that I keep throughout my work with clients.
I even do that if I'm introducing a concept to a client. What I'll oftentimes, or if I'm like intuiting something and I want to bring it into the room, I'll say, hey, I want to bring this up, but I also want to recognize that sometimes I could be reading something wrong. So what I want you to do is listen to it, try it on, see how it fits.
Love
if it doesn't
that.
fit well, let's toss that to the side. Here's what I think. And then I'll let it hang for a moment. And I'll say, how does that fit on you? Does it feel good? Does it feel right? Does it feel true? Does it not? Where are you at in that? Just to let them know that, because I think, that's kind of a popular thing for a therapist to say is you're the expert on you. It's a really easy thing to say, but are you walking with somebody in a way that is making that true?
Right.
Because while we can be the expert on therapy, if they're the expert on them, then we can't say something about them that's going to be true that they disagree with.
Right. So it's acknowledging the power differential in the room.
Yeah,
right?
we can introduce something that maybe they've never thought of or heard of to where before they walked in the room, they may have said they disagreed with it. But if we introduce it, it could introduce them to something that is, oh, yeah, I haven't thought about it that way before. That's not making something true. That's just, it's introducing a different perspective.
And that's therapy.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think this also is making me think about another point that popped up for me in the movie is this idea of, I think therapy is about creating that spaciousness for self-discovery, and the ways that God's promise, right, in the movie just was not that space. Cameron,
the place, yeah,
right, yes, the inpatient, facility, but yeah, right, there wasn't this space for self-exploration in an unconditional way, right? There were some conditions around exploring the iceberg, right? Like, why am I the way that I am? Pathologizing. But even in like language, right? Like Cameron asked her friends, like, oh, like, so do y'all still think you're gay or things like that? But throughout the course of the whole movie, Cameron never was able to try on for fit language around her own sexuality.
Didn't she at one point say that she didn't think of herself as gay?
Right, like this idea of like, I don't think that's who I am, but like maybe, yeah, I don't remember a time where she was like, I think I'm this or I think I'm that, right? This lack of spaciousness to try on, for fear, right, of what might be. So, right, again, I could say a lot about like fear tactics and the ways that like when we operate out of fear, when we're like making choices or decisions out of fear or trying to like control other people out of fear, can end up being really harmful, abusive, fill in the blank.
Well, I think it speaks to, I think a general truth, which there's very few of these, that I've experienced in my life and that I think applies to most people, is that in any kind of fear, there's always a root of the unknown. I'm afraid because there's something that I don't know. And I think that it is a natural response, although not always the healthiest one, in the face of fear, in the face of the unknown, to try to take some control. Because if I have some control, there is a known, there is a concrete, there is a tangible thing that I can grab onto. And in the unknown, much more uncertain, much less balance, what's going on, that kind of thing. And so it seems like that's one of the things that Dr. Marsh is we're taking control. We're putting definitions on things. We're I mean, even something like in cutting Adam's hair, in shaving his hair, I am exerting my power over you. And I just think I'm sure that she was experiencing a shame in her life of, I asked this kid 3 times and he didn't do it. That must mean that I am not a good, whatever she was, therapist, director, or whatever.
Right.
So I'm going to exert control so that I am viewed as a good,
right. Well,
whatever.
And I also saw that tactic of shaving his head, or their head, I don't know what Adam's pronouns are, as punitive, right? This punitive tactic.
Oh, I don't know what punitive means.
So like punishing.
Oh, okay.
Right? Like I think about like the punitive justice system,
That makes
for
sense.
example.
Same root.
Yeah, right. But this idea of like, you didn't conform, you didn't follow the rules, you didn't do what I said, you have made me feel out of control, so I'm going to punish you. And we know, right, as family therapists, we know that like punishment from that perspective does not work with our little ones.
Difference between discipline and punishment.
Right.
Yeah.
And this idea of like, as soon as we take a punitive tactic with someone, it does not bring connection, right? They were not in right relationship there, right? Which sometimes feels like a Christian-y term. But this idea of like, we're good here. Like, he was seething as she was shaving his head, right? And this idea, well, as he should be, right? It was a violation of his like autonomy. But this ability, right? The ways in which people in power, folks with power, wielding that power in like punitive or punishing ways, does not work, right?
Yeah.
It does not get the desired results.
I just thought about a parallel. We talked before we started recording. The guy that plays Rick, John Gallagher Jr., he is also the guy that plays Mason in Short Term 12. In Short Term 12, there is also a scene of them shaving a young man's head. And in that scene, it was Grace and Mason, 2 of the, counselors, there with, and I've already forgotten the character's name, Marcus, I think. He wanted to shave his head because in the abuse that he suffered from his mom, he would have marks on his head. And so he grew his hair out to hide them. He wanted to shave his head as a way of moving forward. And because they knew his story, because they had been with him, in that moment when Grace took the clippers and shaved his head, he stood up, looked in the mirror, asked them, how does it look in the back? And when it was healed, he started crying, and they had this moment of togetherness versus the same act in this movie.
Mm-hmm.
Also by an older woman in a position of authority
Mm-hmm.
over a young man
Mm-hmm.
shaving his head was the exact opposite. It was in fact an action of abuse,
Yes.
because it was an exertion of power over him to
Mm-hmm.
say, you are not my equal. You do not have a voice
Mm-hmm.
in this.
Yeah.
I have the voice. I have the power, and you
Mm-hmm.
will conform and you will submit.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Well, the distinction here, right, that sounds like from this example from Short Term 12, sounds like ritual, right? This idea of bringing into, right, a therapeutic space a marker of a moment of healing,
Mm-hmm.
maybe even like a threshold. We're crossing from one way of knowing yourself into another.
It's like taking off a covering that
Oh,
he had
beautiful.
used to protect himself.
Right. And how do we infuse and mark those moments in therapy?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really beautiful. Part of my like training as a like theologian is to like think about those ways, right? Like how do we maybe like rebaptize a trans person with their new name, for example? Or how do we, right, like how do we infuse ritual and spirituality like into the therapeutic process? So that sounds like a beautiful example
Yeah.
of that in Short Term 12, but absolutely. And then the perversion or the twisting or the the abuse and the abusive tactics that come with Adam's head being shaved, Dr. Marsh shaving Adam's head, in the Miseducation of Cameron Post, and the way that, yes, absolutely. And of course I have a lot more I could say about like punitive tactics, punitive justice, the ways that we know that doesn't work on like the nuclear family level, the way that doesn't work in our current like justice system, and how like punishment in our jails and prisons does not work.
Mm-hmm.
We know that. So it's a whole other conversation we could have about the ways that certain types of, that punishment versus discipline, punishment does not work. And that it actually
It
harms.
speaks to, how punishment is always from a place of separation.
Mm-hmm.
Discipline, and I want to say like in its true form, the way it's intended,
Mm-hmm.
is always from a place of togetherness.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm not trying to separate you. I'm not trying to cut you off.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to help you realize that what's going on could be harmful.
Yeah.
Versus punishment, it's like a casting out. It's
Mm-hmm.
You are separate, you are different, and you're not as good as.
Well, it makes me think about that phrase from the Bible, right? If we're going there, this idea of spare the rod, spoil the child. And a lot of folks use that as a verse to try to...
I can beat my kids. Sure.
Right, exactly, right. To encourage like corporal punishment. Whereas if we go back to the Hebrew, right, the rod that's referred to there is actually a shepherd's rod.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this idea of we guide our sheep with a shepherd's rod. It's not a rod that we would ever use to beat an animal with. Why would we?
Why is there a hook on the end?
Right?
It's to rescue them when they've fallen.
Exactly,
Yeah.
right? So this idea of the rod really being this like guiding utensil or instrument to say like, I'm here, right? Yeah, I'm using this tool that I have to keep you safe, to keep you on the right path, to keep us together, to keep us right in alignment,
Mm-hmm.
to preserve your integrity and your safety. So to even just think about that, it's like, no, it's not punishment. It really is this idea of guiding, of discipline,
But it's
of
from
shepherding.
a together place.
Yes.
Not a separate place.
Yeah. So even, when if that verse ever comes up, I'm like, okay, let's unpack that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the distinction
Well, and I
there.
think like most things in life, context is important.
Mm-hmm.
You're not just dealing with a person in any particular moment.
Right.
There are a lot of moments that led to that one.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
to understand a whole person, you have to get, first off, impossible to get the whole story, but you have to get as much of the story as you can, and always leave room that more story will be introduced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because if there's no binary of good or bad,
Mm-hmm.
then there's also not a binary of I have full understanding and knowledge of this person.
Yeah. Yeah. That, like you said, that spirit of curiosity, that
Yeah.
spirit of inquiry, that posture of not knowing.
Yeah.
That I can't know.
I just think, me experiencing myself as a person, I'm still getting to know me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like 38 3/4 of the way into me, and I don't know everything there is to know about me. how in the world am I going to know everything there is to know about another person?
Yeah.
I have the most access to me, and no matter who the other person is, I have such a limited amount of access to them.
Yeah.
If I can't get a handle on everything there is to know about me, how can I do that with them?
Yeah.
So just to, if I leave that space that I'm still getting to know me, I can also leave that space that I'm still getting to know another person. And that goes back to that you're a complex person. You're complex. You can't be boiled down.
Yeah. That really resonates in terms of thinking about like what my clients have taught me. My clients have taught me a lot of, especially my long-term clients, have taught me a lot of like graciousness. Some of the clients that I met early on in my work that I still see, I was using my legal name still. And my clients who have been on this journey with me in our therapeutic work have also witnessed me shift and change. They've witnessed me shaving my head, right? They've witnessed me changing my name, stepping into my full pronouns, the pronouns that work for me, which are they, them, and saying like, here's my gender identity. So being able to have this be this like iterative process of
They've offered you grace.
Oh, absolutely.
Has that been a healing process for you?
I think so. I think it's been healing. I think it's been definitely affirming. Like it's been
That's
on
what
that
I was looking
level.
for. Yeah.
Affirmation for sure. Clients who say, okay, great. Thanks for letting me know your name's Gert now. Like, I will call you that. I will use your pronouns. Like, thanks for letting me know. So this ability to, it's a little bit of practice what I preach, right? It's a little bit of saying, like, if I'm inviting folks to step more fully into their true identity, and to step further and further into their own journeys, like, I can't not do that, right?
Well, practice what I preach is one way of saying it. I think another way of saying it is, I don't think any therapist would have any problem recognizing the courage that their clients display in their journey towards health, healing, and hope. I think because every therapist is a person, we all have a bad case of being a person, and it's terminal. Sometimes we can look to our clients as inspiration in the courage that they display, in displaying our own courage.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I was working with trans clients before I identified as trans, right? And I don't, it's not like a causational thing, but it's this idea of saying, hold on, like the more more trans friends I have, but also like, more community that I have outside of my professional life, but also like the more trans clients I had, the more we were like moving into conversations about gender and gender identity, that I was like, I can't not be like doing my own work around this. And what unfolded was more of me stepping into like my own identity with the support of folks outside of my therapy room, right?
Sure.
Knowing like, hold on, where does my support come from? It comes from community. It comes from family. It comes from trusted others. But yeah, me doing my own work, my own self-exploration, and being able to say, here I am, unapologetically, with my full dignity to my clients, is to say, I'm here, I am showing up. Let's see what you can do too.
Do you think that encountering more stories of trans people, and I don't mean stories in the sense of you read a thing, you saw a thing, you sat with a story. Do you think that encountering more stories, I don't know how to ask it, gave you permission to do your own work, emboldened you to do your own work, inspired you to do your own work? Like, do you think that the stories that you encountered helped in that?
You saying that question really makes me think about this idea of possibility models, that it's not like role models, but this idea, I think, what's her name who like coined that phrase? She's on Orange is the New Black.
On it?
Yeah, she's the, Laverne Cox.
Yes. Yeah.
So Laverne Cox uses this phrase, possibility models, that it's not role models, people that we want to like grow up to become, but like possibility models, people who model for us possibilities of who we might be. So I would say absolutely, right? The more like possibility models that I have had in my life, whether they knew it or not, or whether I was even conscious of it or not, right? I remember my first friend that I ever had who used they, them pronouns. I met maybe like, this was like years ago. And they were the first person that I ever met who used they, them pronouns. And they were unapologetic about it. These are my pronouns. I'm non-binary. I'm trans. This is who I am. And I just looked at them and I said, whoa, like I've never encountered this before. I didn't know this was a thing. I had to like work on like crafting my language to like meet them where they were at in terms of their pronouns. And because of my interaction with this person, Petey, I can look back on that now and say, whoa, if it were not for Petey in my life, and for the modeling that they did for me, I might not be in the place where I am now, or my journey might have been harder, right? That it might have taken me longer or been harder for me to like really deeply understand myself, or to have the permission to even try on like different pronouns. So absolutely, right? Like this is a part of a bigger conversation about how, and I trust that, right? I trust that within the queer community, that we are all in the business of inviting each other to our best selves, and into our like deepest and fullest integrity, and doing that unapologetically, saying like, yeah, bring it, like bring who you are. So I think that's just part of like the therapeutic space that I create, is saying like, whether you're queer or not, like client, right? I'm going to be like queering this idea of like who you are or what you are. Yes. I love queer as a verb. I love it.
I'm jiving with it.
Yeah.
So I mentioned that project that I did in Dr. Hopkins' class. The way that I concluded the presentation was in telling 4 stories of people discovering their gender identity, one of which was Caitlyn Jenner, one of which was a transgender young lady winning homecoming queen at her high school in, I believe it was Kansas City, which happened. I didn't know this prior to finding the story. One of my cohort mates, Aaron, who was on a previous episode, that was his high school.
Wow.
He went there. And I told the stories, and I said, as therapists, whether we want to quote unquote specialize in serving the LGBTQ population, we would do well to engage in the stories, because as we look back over history, if we were to remain on a surface level, we may see, oh, well, it looks like the LGBTQ community began to explode in growth at X year, whether it's 73 or 69 or whenever it was, and how all of a sudden, it's just becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, and it was not existent before, or whatever. When I think, as I was looking through, what I really found was that's when the stories began to be told. And I have never heard, up until the moment you mentioned it, the words possibility model. And I think that that's what showed up, is all of a sudden people who internally were experiencing something and wrestling with something and figuring out, how do I as my true self show up? How do I even figure out my true self? All of a sudden they see a story of somebody who did it. They read about a story of another person who did it. They see a news report or a television program or a movie or whatever it is, and they realize, oh, that's a real person who's experiencing life in this real way. And I like what you said of, it's not necessarily a role model, because it's not necessarily, I want to be that, I want to be who they are, but I think it gives a little more room. And kind of the way that I always conceptualize it is, when I was in middle school, I had a Sega Genesis, and there was a game on the Sega Genesis called Toe Jam and Earl, and it was about these 2 aliens that crash landed on Earth, and their spaceship blew up into 100-something pieces, and they got scattered all over. And so you had to, as one of the aliens, go find the pieces. Well, if you clicked pause, instead of seeing the game, you saw a map. And at the beginning of the movie, the whole screen was black, except for in the middle, a little tiny circle with the 2 aliens and with green behind it, because they were standing on ground. As you played the movie and you explored, whenever you hit the pause button, it showed the map, and everywhere you had been showed the ground.
Wow.
It unblacked the pause screen. And I like to always think about possibility models as that. It's that all of a sudden you now see that there are other things. And so it's not necessarily, oh, I want to go there on the map, so much as, oh my gosh, there's a there. There's a there, and I can see that there's a there, and that's great. And so I think that the more stories that are told, the more possibility it gives for a person to, and it's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about movies and story in general, is it's powerful. It's how humans forever have conceptualized their experience on earth. And the more that we give room for people to tell their story, not only are we benefiting the storyteller, but we're benefiting all of the people who could potentially hear it, because it gives them a possibility.
Yep. Absolutely.
And I can't think of anything better.
Yep. It's a creative process, right?
Yeah.
It's definitely not all or nothing.
Yeah.
Black or white. It's what are the avenues? What are the possibilities? I think it's just,
And I never finished that whole map. It's probably, yeah.
Oh, wow.
And I don't know, and that's kind of, to get really like meta, I don't know if the whole map could ever be finished for us as people. Not every story can ever be told.
Yep.
So, for us as therapists, for us as people, to continue to provide that space for people to feel safe in telling their story, the more possibility.
Yeah. Right. This idea of, who do I bear witness to? Like, whose stories am I witnessing? My therapist said something really beautiful to me once. She's like, I only know you to the extent that you've allowed me to know you. And I was like, oh gosh, that's so real, right? Like, even in this relationship that I've been in, where I've done, been able to do like deep work, she only knows me to the extent that I've given her permission. Talk
about a covert to overt moment.
Right?
Like, wow.
Yeah. She just is like, that's right. Because again, giving me the power and saying like, oh, right, I've been able to determine like how much of myself this therapist knows. And that I'm in control of my narrative, even in that space.
Wow.
So,
Is there anything else from the movie that you want to touch on?
I don't think so. I mean, I did notice, just as we were talking a lot about kind of these intersecting oppressions, I did make a list of all of the ones that I noticed in the movie. And I was like, wow, there's really a lot that these kids were like up against.
Can we bullet point them?
Yeah. So, definitely like ableism showed up. I can't think of the exact example, but there was, I know it showed up.
Jane?
Maybe
with her
it
amputation?
was Jane, and maybe the amputee. There was also some like language around just like, oh, maybe it was like a slur that was used. I think maybe at one point someone used something like crippled or like blind or something like that, which like are like ableist slurs, right? Talking about like the ways that bodies are bad, rather than saying like, no, all bodies are good. Like, so I noticed like ableism show up, obviously homophobia and transphobia, and misogyny and patriarchy, right? This idea of like shaming that which is feminine or female, xenophobia, right? Or like we talked about colonization, especially around the two-spirit character. What's his name? Adam. Yeah, this idea of saying like, hold on, like unless like your gender and gender expression fits the model of like straight, cis, and white, right? Then it's like not good or it's bad. So like just a stripping away of like indigenous like understandings of gender and indigenous spirituality. So again, like with that also comes Christian supremacy as an oppressive dynamic, saying that there's like that Christianity reigns supreme rather than other alternative faiths or spiritualities. And then ageism, which we talked about. And of course, like racism plays into like colonization and xenophobia. So I was just like, dang, these kids are up against a lot. And the ways that like all of these systems feed into each other, then they perpetuate each other. So being able again to visibilize and see like, hold on, let's slow this down. What oppressive system is at play here? And how do we unpack that? How do we resist that? Resist internalizing those messages about ourselves, right? Resist internalizing homophobia, resisting internalizing xenophobia, colonization, and saying like, actually, no, those are death-dealing systems that want to keep me small, want to keep me silent, want me dead, honestly, right? They're death-dealing systems. So how do we resist them in a way and step into alternative models, other sources of information that are actually speaking truth and life to people?
Well, it reminds me of what we said towards the beginning of like even using the word crazy. I don't understand, and so I dismiss.
Right.
And it's a similar thing. Like you're different than me, and so I want you gone.
Yeah.
Terribly, terribly damaging thing. So in our conversation, one thing that I was thinking of asking you was, how can we as a people and we as therapists support people in the LGBTQI plus community? But I could still ask you that. I really think if you just listen to this whole episode, I think
Yeah.
there's a long form answer there that
Yeah.
I would be hesitant to bullet point kind of towards the end, because I think, like we've been saying, people are complex. They're not binary, so I would hate to kind of like boil that down. But is
Right.
there anything that you may want to add in
Well,
towards being supportive?
yes, and I think it's something that you said before we even hit record, which is this idea of you modeling this idea of acknowledging your like social location and noticing like where you and how you show up in this world. So you acknowledge to me, you're like, Gert, like I'm cis, I'm straight, I'm white, right, middle class, like I have a lot going for me in terms of privilege. And I think that is a big invitation, is for folks to sit with that and to acknowledge, wait, how do I show up in the world? What privileges do I have? And how can I honor that there is different in the world, that other folks experience the world very differently, and that it isn't, right? You sit here and say, that's not like, you weren't taking a normative posture and saying like, this is how things should be. You were like, this is who I know myself to be and my perspective in the world, and and you said, I'm taking this posture of curiosity and openness and not knowing. So that really is the invitation for folks who find themselves in one of those buckets that make them more aligned in positions of power. If you're white, if you're cis, if you're straight, if you in class wise, if you're like upper middle class or have access to like generational wealth, if you're able-bodied. So just acknowledging like, wow, like this is my reality, and how do I honor difference and celebrate difference wherever that shows up. Or like, and the hard question of, or how am I not, right? How am I not, or how am I perpetuating or being complicit in systems that actually do harm other people? Because again, I trust human goodness, and I trust that if we're really honest with ourselves, no one wants to be causing harm in that way, right? That does make us feel out of alignment. So the work or the invitation is to notice, how am I out of alignment with who I want to be, right? Oh, hold on, did I just avert my eyes from that like a street-based person?
Yeah.
And what does that do to my integrity? Right? That doesn't feel right, right?
Yeah.
But
Or
to
I
be-
even like the
yeah.
alignment piece. Integrity for me, at some point I had heard somebody in my circle who would identify themselves as a fundamentalist evangelical talk about integrity, and so I said, let's look up that word and see what it
Yeah.
means. Dictionary definition is just that you adhere to the set of principles or morals that you espouse. And so I think that gives a lot of room, because it's basically saying, if you say you are, then you do, which could be, I say I'm a terrible person, so I do terrible things, and have integrity. So like, I think it would go more in line with alignment, like than actual integrity, because I wouldn't want somebody to just say, hey, I hate everybody and I show it, and so I have a lot of integrity. But like, are you aligned with what's going on inside? Congruency might be another way of saying that.
Yeah. And maybe that's me like showing my cards as someone who does really kind of believe the best in folks. Like I think at core, most of us know on some level, like it's hard to see someone who does not have access to things in the right basic needs, right? It's hard to witness someone who does not have their basic needs met. And that on a human level, right? And maybe that's me thinking, going back to that base sense of like, what's my integrity? How am I being in alignment or with integrity to like my humanness? To say like, oh, right, in my humanness, something inside me tells me that doesn't feel right. Something's wrong here. And then there are lots of like oppressive systems that show up and try to like disconnect me or disembody me from that feeling. So capitalism tells me that person's lazy, right? And that's why they're poor. That's why they're homeless or street-based. Ableism tells me that person is sick. They're disabled. They are crazy, right? And that's why they're homeless. So being able to like just notice like the imperatives or the messages from these death dealing systems that try to disconnect us from our like deep humanity, right? It's dehumanizing, right? There's a
Yeah.
dehumanizing process that we do both to ourselves and disconnecting from that gut feeling, and of course we're doing it to other when we discard. So I'm a big resistor of like disposability,
Yeah.
right? That no one is disposable, but there are a lot of toxic systems that try to tell us otherwise. So to push those out, to resist those, and to like listen in to what is deeply human about us that says this person needs support and help,
Yeah.
and I'm in radical solidarity with them. That takes a lot of work.
Yeah.
And we all have to start somewhere.
Yeah.
So
I didn't mean to make it sound like I was saying integrity is not right.
No.
I only meant to say like, oh, I've wrestled with that, and this is where I
Sure.
came down on.
Yeah.
Just kind of in my head conceptualizing it a different way, because I
Yeah.
thought in my story, I would have said before I got into therapy, I have integrity. Because and I started to wrestle with oh well, do I? Am I really espousing the things that I say I believe in?
Yeah.
And then that's when I got to the, well, which matters more, what I believe or what I do? And so for me, it was, which is my own stuff. You mentioned earlier what, or something that you had learned from your clients was graciousness. Is there anything else that you would want to add in that your clients have given you?
I think I've learned from my clients, or I've witnessed from my clients, just human resiliency, the ways that we as human beings are resilient in the face of oppression, in the face of difficulty, life or death sometimes, situations that humans, like we are resilient, and my clients have just reminded me of that and shown me that. And again, this idea of stepping into their stories, like that theme of resilience continues to show up. So it's a beautiful reminder, right? Especially in those moments where it's like, okay, like I'm sick today and I have to cancel this session. And it's like, oh wait, I can rely on, like, I know my clients are resilient, right? That they have the ability to like take care of themselves, and that, you know, there's just a beautiful, like, protective factor that I'm like, oh yeah, my clients are so resilient.
And sometimes they don't even know that they are.
Right.
But I think that, you know, one way that we're always able to trust that is the old, you know, well, if you're sitting in front of me or if you're on the phone with me, you're resilient.
Yeah.
Because, you know, even the person who struggles against the deepest clinical depression when they're sitting in front of you, tell me how you made it here today.
Yeah. How'd you do that?
How did you get out of bed? How did you defeat the blanket monster that tries to hold you down every day?
Yeah.
And I think that we all have that spark of resiliency in us, and something that we as therapists can do for people is to fan that flame and help that resilience grow.
Yep. To bring consciousness to, the ways that you're doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's say that somebody was listening to our conversation today and they just think, man, I am a giant fan of Gert. I would love to see them as a client. How can they get a hold of you?
So the best way to reach me is either going to be email, which is comfrey.counseling@gmail.com. So comfrey.counseling@gmail.com. Or I have some folks who are following me on Instagram. So I have an Instagram account where I post kind of tidbits about therapy and mental health, but that's at Gert Comfrey. So that's just my name, at Gert, Gert, Comfrey, Comfrey.
Nice.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here today.
Of
It has just
course.
been the biggest honor and pleasure to be able to sit with you and hear some of your story and just hear your perspective on this movie and a lot of the things that it brings up.
Yeah, there's so much to talk about, and thanks for the time and the space to share and talk about all of this.
Absolutely.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah. Hey, my love.
Hello.
So there have been several episodes that, upon completion of the interview, that I knew were going to be big. And this is one of them.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to I don't want to devote much time to us chit-chatting. Although I'm sure that it's a favorite of every episode for
The
for our
nonsense that
listeners.
we talk about.
Yeah. But I just want to jump right in. So, Gert, wow.
Yeah, wow is
Just
right.
wow.
I'm a big fan. Like,
Yeah.
big fan.
Yeah,
I
same.
follow them on Instagram already.
So what do you got?
Oh, man. First off, I have enough thoughts and things to talk about that I already have had to just, say to myself, you're not going to be able to get to everything, because this episode was just so good. It was just so good.
Yeah, it's very thought-provoking, very engaging, because I think that the perspective that they brought to the movie and the thoughtfulness that came from their personal work and clinical work was very enlightening.
Yeah. Yeah.
And very needed.
Yeah. So, I mean, first off, I just love that y'all touched on oppression and identities and privilege and the intersecting, just intersectionality, like, what that is, and having, maybe two or more identities that are marginalized in this world. And I love that they talked about kind of their work with clients around that. And I also, it reminded me of two things. One is there's an exercise called a privilege wheel. I'm sure there's a lot like it. But if anybody wants to just like Google privilege wheel, I bet you'll find pretty much what it is. It just is it's kind of a tool to kind of think through your identities and, which ones are privileged, and like recognizing which ones are privileged identities, and also vice versa. Like if you do identify with a group that's marginalized and hold that identity, it's just good for awareness, like self-awareness. And I think like you guys talked, and I'll we'll talk more about it, but you guys talked about being aware of like the space that you hold in a room. And I think that is a cool way to learn. It also made me think about the first time I felt like I understood privilege, and it's possible that I have said this story before on the podcast, so I won't.
If so, it's probably the Moonlight episode, but I don't remember.
Yeah. Well, skip ahead if you've heard it before, but basically in college at some point, in the process of looking for a roommate, there was just a moment, and I think it's because I was in social work school at that point, and so I was around people who were different from me, maybe more so than I had been before. And I remember there being a moment where it really sunk in for me that when when a roommate found me or I found a roommate, I didn't have to worry about, is this roommate a racist against a race that I am? Or is this roommate a homophobic and I, identify as LGBTQ plus? Like, because I am a cisgender white, female identifying person, like, and was assigned female at birth, like, there's so much privilege in that I never had to worry. And I think for some reason, I think being around people who maybe did, it just hit me that, when I walk into a room, I don't have to worry about how people are going to receive me. And not everybody has that experience. And so I just remember that being the first time I think that it deeply, deeply, deeply sunk in what it really meant, like what privilege really meant.
Yeah, I think on the episode with Sasha that I did on Moonlight, the way that I conceptualized it was I have the privilege of being ignorant to having to think about those things.
For sure.
Like and the privilege wheel is a great tool for people to Google. Maybe a shortcut is if you've never had to think about if you have privilege. Mm-hmm. You've got privilege.
Yeah.
Like if this is a concept that you've never heard of and you're in your mid to late 20s, you've got privilege.
For sure. Yeah.
Still pursue the wheel. That's a shortcut.
Dive more into it.
Yeah.
Become more aware. Yeah. So that was just a thought that came up while you guys were talking. I think kind of along those same lines, they talked about the world working against some identities and people, and then reducing distress of those people who, the world is working against. And it reminded me of a conversation I had recently where someone pointed out that when we were talking about conflict, so we were talking about conflict on my team at work, and one of my team members said the very wise and well-made point that when a kid of color, like when your skin color is quote unquote in conflict with society, or the race that has power in society, then you don't walk into, like, there's just something extra added there. There's extra tension added there, and that person, color's never absent from a conversation or a conflict or a situation. And I think in the same way, like, people's identities are never absent. And I don't know, I think I liked that idea of, that they brought out of, okay, there are people, people have these identities, they might be oppressed in ways, and that causes distress. And so how can we reduce that? I think you said earlier how they were talking about using pronouns as suicide prevention, and that just was so powerful, like so powerful,
Yeah.
and true.
Yeah, I think it reminds me that to approach everyone with curiosity and respect.
Mm-hmm.
Curiosity in the sense of wanting to learn about them,
Yeah.
wanting to know them, not know about them, but know them.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, that type of attitude, it's very, dignified. It's very humane. It's very respectful.
Mm-hmm.
And I think especially for a person who has privilege, to approach others that way,
Mm-hmm.
would be very world changing.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. 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 Let's see. So I think that sort of, you guys talked about terminology and like, just all the different like kind of terms and labels and names for identities that people have. And we've done a lot of, trainings at work really targeted towards working with LGBTQIA, plus kids, and making sure that our mentors are prepared to support kids who might come out at some point. And I just think it's kind of what you were just saying. Like it's a way of showing respect, I feel like, to just refer to someone the way that they want to be referred to, like pronouns, how they identify at, whatever it is. Like, I always try to just take the lead of the person themselves, and like just what you were just saying, being curious and letting them lead that. I feel like it like gives value to what they've identified as. You guys kind of talked about sort of getting into the movie conditional versus like unconditional love, and this idea of saying to a kid, whether directly or indirectly through action, I love you despite blank. And I just thought, I'm thinking both because the movie was about kids and also because I work with kids. I don't know which one. I don't know why I thought about this in reference to kids, but I just thought like it can be so damaging to a child to hear I love you despite this, because what that does is it tells that child that this person in your life still loves you even though blank, but other people won't. like this, whatever the blank is, that's going to be a reason that people wouldn't love you, because that's what that person's saying. Like, basically, this is a really unlovable thing about you, but I still love you even though. Like, that's what that communicates. And I just think for a child, in all of the developmental stages that children go through, to think that somebody's support and love and care for them hinges on a quality about them. Yeah, that could just be so harmful. So I think, love kids unconditionally. Like that's what they need to develop into who they really are.
Yeah. And I am reminded of, so I have listened to all of the episodes that have come out so far of Terry Murphy, past podcast guest, Dr. Terry Murphy, of her podcast that has just come out. It's called I'll Go First. If you're listening to this, go on over, subscribe to that, download it, listen. One thing that, Terry has talked about on there, and I know that I've mentioned a few times on here, are faulty core messages that, like, we carry with us throughout our life. When a kid is born into the world, a kid doesn't have any faulty core messages. A kid grows up and, just thinks the world is what it encounters and approaches everything with a sense of awe and wonder. And really I'd like to say it's the world. I think it's really the people that are around the kid that begin to grind the kid down and teach the kid that not only are there things that are wrong with the world, but there are things that are wrong with the kid.
I think the world, though, too, because, like, teachers, classmates, like, media that they're exposed to.
It's true.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that telling a kid, I love you in spite of this, could potentially grow in the kid a faulty core message. I think it's teaching the kid, this aspect of you sticks out farther than it should. This aspect of you is unacceptable. This aspect of you is wrong. It's broken. It's no good. I love you even though I'm telling you that part of you is no good. And so I think even though the person saying it might have good intentions, it's still pointing out something. It's still noticing something. It's still saying, hey, look at that.
It's other.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which, while we're on this subject, let me just pull out a quote from Gert that I truly do think that I'm gonna type this up on a pretty thing and print it out and put it at my desk. They said they were talking about asking a child this. Asking a child, what wisdom do you have about what you're learning about your own identity and how you see the world? Ugh. I could have just fallen out of my car when I was listening to that. Because what a powerful question and what a powerful perspective to bring into your interactions with a child. To not be like, I'm going to tell you how things should be and shouldn't be, but instead to say, hey, tell me what you know. Tell me what you're learning and like what you're figuring out. Because that's what they're doing at that stage.
It reminds me of, that I'm a big fan of Malcolm Gladwell. There's a story in a Malcolm Gladwell book about a parent taking their kid to the doctor, and on the way to the doctor asking the kid, what questions would you like to ask the doctor? And then in the doctor's appointment, kind of turning, I don't know what the right word is, control of the appointment over to the kid. Do you remember the questions you wanted to ask the doctor? And it's not just giving the kid a chance to think about important things, but it's also giving the kid a voice, which in fact gives the kid power to, take, I don't know about control, but to have a voice in what's going on with their body, to know that they are important enough to ask an adult questions, when it comes to stuff that has to do with them. And so I think that question that that you pulled out that Gert said, when asked to a kid does something similar, that it brings a kid up to your level.
Yeah.
And lets them know that, you know, in the room, you as the adult aren't the only one that has something worth contributing.
Yeah.
But they do as well.
Yeah.
I think it's important.
Yeah. So I think another thing that I just wanted to kind of point out a difference about was when you were talking about shame, and you were talking about it in reference to Mark. Mark harming himself, and you kind of related it to like when addicts will have shame and kind of will be like, oh, my genitalia is the problem. Like they want to find something that's like, well, if it wasn't for this, if I didn't have this, if I cut this off, like
it's in a moment of feeling out of control.
Yeah.
They want to be in control, so they need to point to something.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think like, yes, similar things, you know, in that moment and that led to Mark taking that action. But I think a key difference is that these kids in the movie it's not that they were doing something and internally they were like, I know this is wrong, so I feel shame. They were being shamed by people in their lives and by their
yes.
Yeah. And I think with like addicts or maybe other cases, there's like an internal like, I acted out of this unhealthy place. You know, I took a drug, I did like whatever, like it, you know, that's like an internally driven shame maybe.
Yeah. It's, as I was making that point, I think I realized I'm creeping up on something that's really dangerous. And I did not mean to equate those things at all. I think I was just mainly thinking, oh, here's how this translates in my work.
Yeah.
You know, I also am reminded of that quote that Cameron said in the movie, you know, how is programming people to hate themselves not emotional abuse? You know, and each of these kids that were at this facility were being told by everybody around them that they were wrong. So I think, you know, you bring up a really, really good point, and that is that this wasn't an internal issue which, like I said a few minutes ago, that a kid would have thought to themselves, there's something wrong with me, and so I got to wrestle with this. This is something that's a part of them that another person was saying, this is wrong with you.
Right.
Well, and so they're trying to reconcile this thing that's within them with these primary attachment figures that have been, you know, given charge to care for them and supposedly love them, saying these things to them.
Yeah. And the messages that they've heard directly and indirectly from society, from everywhere. Yeah. I think that's mainly it. I thought hearing about possibility models was really cool.
That was really cool.
Working in mentoring, where the word role model is thrown around a lot. I definitely had a big like, oh my gosh, I am from now on never going to use the word role model.
Well, as we were recording, I thought that I wanted to wrap up by asking you a question, because since you got so much from the episode, and because I think so much of what Gert talked about is applicable to what you do, you know, after hearing it, is there anything that you can think of that maybe you might do differently now in your role?
I think so. When I don't know if there's anything that was like that I heard that I thought, oh my gosh, I've never thought about that before, and this changes, you know, how I behave in a certain situation. A lot of that though is because I've learned about similar things, and I've tried to be really self-aware of my own, like the space that I hold. And also this entire year, because of a grant that we got and because of our agency's mission and whatever, like we've been really focused on serving LGBTQ kids, and So we've gotten a lot of trainings. So all of that to say, I feel like because I've been really intentionally focusing on this for a while at work, I don't know if I would say right now in this moment that I would change anything that I would do. But I mean, I think every ounce of understanding that I can get, about a queer kid's experience in this world informs what I do. Like, absolutely. And so in that way, like it absolutely, it's going to change and help the way that I interact with kids or bigs or, whoever, like at work and in what I do, just to try to hold the space in a way that's like safe and affirming and celebrating, like you guys said. And yeah, I think it gives a lot of context to kids who don't have affirming, caregivers, which is, I mean, it happens often, to be honest. I think I can think of at least a handful off the top of my head that I know that I think the child is in the process of coming out and the caregiver is not supportive. So I think it just gives a lot of context to what that does, to a person, and maybe helps us think through, like, how can we be a supportive presence in that child's life, despite, their primary caregiver not being one.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it's safe to say this is one of my absolute favorite episodes.
Yeah.
Which
Thank
I know
you,
I
Gert.
say that a lot, but every time I say it, I mean it. I'm completely genuine in it. I think, similar to what Gert said about, being curious and, respecting people. Every guest that comes to the theater and that I have the great privilege and chance to talk with, I try to approach with curiosity. I try to approach with learning as much as I can about them, and through that approach, walk away just being the biggest fan of them. They are the 32nd person who I've gotten to sit with and chat with, and I can look back over these episodes and think I have been in the presence of 32 giants who are changing the world every single day, and changing multiple worlds, as each client that they have is a whole world unto themselves. And it's just, in addition to the work that I get to do with clients, to have a chance to host this show and talk with these people, it is the best jobs in the whole world. And I can't believe that I get to do this. It's incredible. So all that to say, it was incredible, and I think we can probably close up shop. So let's go ahead and say that we're going to let's go ahead and say that we're going to raise the lights, lower the curtain, and say that at least for this week, the theater is closed.